So now we're looking at some quadratic equations. And all the word quadratic means is that you're going to have a variable in your equation that is raised to the power of 2. So over here you can see we've got x to the power of 2 or x squared. Over here we've got y to the power of 2 or y squared over 5. And down here as well we've got variables that are raised to the power of 2. So that means that it's a quadratic equation. When we say x squared equals 36, what we mean by that is we mean x times itself, don't we? Because any number squared is the same as saying any number multiplied by itself. So we can actually rewrite that as x multiplied by x equals 36. Now that looks a bit more simple. What number multiplied by itself gives you 36? Well, we know that the square root of 36 is 6. So we know that 6 works for this because 6 times 6 is 36. So that works. It works when x equals 6. So x equals 6 is one solution to this equation. Now with quadratic equations, generally speaking, there are going to be two solutions. And the other solution to this equation is actually minus 6. Because we also know that minus 6 times minus 6 is 36. We know that a negative number times another negative number gives you a positive number. So that means that there are two solutions to this equation. One of the solutions is x equals 6, and the other solution is x equals minus 6. So whenever you're solving a quadratic equation, don't forget to think about the negative of the square root as well. So you can also write this as x is equal to plus or minus 6 if you want to save time. Both of these ways of writing it are fine. So let's move on to this question. Now this one is also pretty easy. There's just one more step, and that is that we need to isolate this x squared. So it's the same as if it were just a regular equation. We can just treat this as an x for now. All we need to do is isolate it. So we need to get rid of this 8 minus 81. And now we've got x squared equals 81. So x multiplied by itself gives you 81. Now, what's the square root of 81? Square root of 81, if we know our 9 times tables, is 9. So if we square root both sides, we end up with x on this side because the square root just undoes this. It's kind of like cancelling out. And then on the right hand side, we've got 81. The square root of 81 is plus or minus 9. Don't forget the minus 9, because minus 9 times minus 9 is also 81. So there's two solutions to that as well. Now up here we've got another one. So again, it looks pretty straightforward. It's just that this time there's going to be two steps before we can isolate y squared. So we'll get rid of this minus 2. We're left with y squared over 5 equals 11. We want to get rid of this division by 5, so we need to multiply by 5. That leaves us with y squared is equal to 55. And now we've got our simple quadratic again, so all we need to do is take the square root of both sides. The square root of y squared is just y. That's how we undo this with the inverse operation. And we need the square root, we need the positive and negative square root of 55. Now, what is the square root of 55? There's actually no whole number that when you multiply it by itself gives you 55. So it's going to give you a long decimal like this. So this isn't going to be an accurate solution because it's actually going to keep continuing on, and we're rounding off. Even the calculator's rounding off there. So this is not an exact solution. So this is an exact solution, and we can actually just leave it like that. And sometimes the question will ask you to leave it in exact form or in surd form. And that's how you leave it in exact form or surd form. This is a surd right here. So it's plus or minus root 55. That's the two solutions. Now, if they ask you to write it in decimal form, you can also write y equals plus or minus 7 point, and they say write it to one decimal place, 7.4. Now, this is not exact. This is an approximation, so you could even write the approximate symbol. All right. So it really depends on the question, whether they ask you to leave it in surd form or exact form, or whether they ask you to put it in decimal form. Now this question here, this is kind of a fun one. We just need to isolate y squared. So we subtract 30 from both sides. Now they both cancel out. So we're left with y squared on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we're left with 30 minus 30, which is just 0. Now, what's the square root of 0? Well, it's just 0, isn't it? So we can write positive or negative 0, but positive and negative 0 are the same thing because 0 is not positive nor negative. So there's actually only one solution to this equation, and that's a special type of equation where there's only one solution. And lastly, let's look at this example here. Now this is an interesting one. It looks very simple, so let's just try and solve it and see what happens. So we'll isolate x squared. X squared is equal to minus 4. And now we just need to take the square root of both sides. Square root of the left is just x, and the square root of the right, well, we need the positive and negative square root of negative 4. Now what's the square root of negative 4? Is there a number that when multiplied by itself gives you negative 4? Well, the calculator says there's an error, and that's because you cannot take the square root of a negative number. There's no real number that when multiplied by itself gives you a negative number. And that's because, well, let's see, what's the square root of 4? 2. So let's try 2. So 2 times 2, 2 squared, gives you 4. So it doesn't give you negative 4. All right, so what about minus 2? Minus 2 times minus 2, well, that also gives you 4. It doesn't give you negative 4. The only way you can get negative 4 when you multiply two numbers together is if one of the numbers is positive and one of the numbers is negative. That's the only way you're going to get a negative number. But that's impossible because we're multiplying the number by itself, so we can't change the sign of one of them. It has to be the exact same sign. So if you get a square root of a negative number, you just need to write that there's no real solution. And that's all we need to worry about for those types of questions.